am not a Jew who stands with Israel in this war. I can't make myself that kind of Jew, and it makes me unpopular with quite a lot in my own community, and that's the way it is.
Welcome back to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast that aims to guide you towards a more resilient life and whatever it might throw at you. If this is your first time with us, then do please hit subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. It really does help make sure these, I hope, useful conversations are shared as widely as possible. Earlier this week, I was joined by the award-winning author, commentator, publisher, and quite possibly one of the world's most connected women, Julia Hobsbawm. During the course of her brilliant career, Julia has faced business, serious personal and health crises, and yet she strides on time and time again with a drive and resilience and a sense of humour, I should add, from which I think we can all learn. From living in the shadow of her renowned father, the communist historian Eric Hobsbawm, to founding and in one instance closing her own companies, receiving an OBE and writing 7 books along the way, Julia's is a life littered with triumph and crisis. Her latest book, Working Assumptions, is a must-read for anyone concerned about the future of work and the workplace crisis business leaders are now wrestling with. I hope you enjoy this episode. Julia Hobsbawm, welcome to Crisis What Crisis. How are you?
What a big up. Well, I've got a dog crisis at the moment, as I said to you before we came on air. Yes, my life must be littered with crises. Just for you, Andy.
You've got one.
I laid one on this morning.
You've got one this morning. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Julia, before we get started, let's get this out of the way. We've worked together a little. We are pals. And we share, I think, a strong belief in the strategic healing power of an early evening martini. You're known as a woman who can connect people. Indeed, you once held the title of Professor of Networking, a title I think you gave up.
Yes.
But let's discuss that later.
Silly title to be discussed.
Let's discuss it later.
My pretend professor years. Yes.
But rather than networking, I would suggest your superpower actually is loyalty. Oh. You're a fiercely loyal individual. You have no problem with sticking by those who fall out of fashion for one reason or another, maybe scandal. You're a run towards the gunfire kind of woman.
Well, I take that as a compliment. I think I am. I hope I am. Yes, I don't have a problem being loyal, outside of the boundaries of fashion. In fact, I'm really interested actually in the public mood and how people are often doing things that they don't question because they're fashionable, rather than sticking to what they know and what they feel and what's right.
It's less about fashion, my point, I think. It's much more about risk.
Okay.
Right, because you are, as I said in the intro, super connected. Right, you put people together. Right, you're a zeitgeist kind of operator. And quite often, those types of people are very sensitive to difficulty and to scandal.
Yes, I'm not.
They tend to kind of step into the wallpaper when those moments come.
No, well, I mean, I don't abandon my friends is the first thing, and the second thing is that I also don't feel I hit a tribal box. So I'm sort of circling back to the point that I called fashion a moment ago. I think lots of people act tribally. They act in a group, they act in a way, and then if somebody that they might be friends with falls out of fashion or falls foul of certain norms or rules or whatever, then they scuttle. And that isn't my thing. I'm just interested case by case. And yeah, I'm loyal. I'm also, I am an entrepreneur. I mean, I'm not the entrepreneur that makes squillions kind of entrepreneur, Andy, I should hasten to say, but I am an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs take risks.
Yes. We like to try and trace back characteristics on this pod. So if I were to try and trace back that characteristic of yours, the kind of running towards the gunfire, does that take me to your dad?
Yeah, I
think...
Who
was eminent, renowned, but also pretty controversial.
Yeah.
Right? You've used the word Marmite,
Yeah.
I mean, such an accomplished academic, but, a man of controversy as well at times.
Yeah, so he was what was called in its day a Euro-communist. He was an intellectual. But there were, and there still are, some who effectively branded him a sort of murdering Stalinist, even though he would say that he wasn't. And I don't think he was either, as it happens. But yeah, he was controversial. He stuck with the Communist Party because he came of age literally in Germany. He was born in 1917, not in Germany, but that's another story. But he grew up in Berlin. So he was a teenager when Hitler came to power in 1933. That made him join the Communist Party. And through the Communist Party's trials and tribulations as the 20th century progressed, there were moments when lots of people did leave and he didn't. So from that point of view, I think you're right. I probably learned a stubborn stoicism from him.
Being the daughter of such a brilliant man can't have been easy. High expectations. Just tell me a little bit about the childhood.
Well, I think in a way, being the daughter, I didn't have very big expectations. I mean, generationally, you know, I cling to the hashtag only 59, Andy, but only for a couple more months. My mother is engulfed by Alzheimer's at the moment now, and she's 92. But in her day, she was pretty remarkable. But there were no expectations on her, because it was the era when there weren't expectations of women. And I was the daughter. So to some degree, I didn't face pressure. And I felt a bit ignored. Like, I wanted the pressure. I wanted to.
The surname alone must have brought a certain expectation.
That brought sort of almost mistaken identity issues. You know, even to this day, some people are disappointed that I'm not like my father politically, and so, you know, that it's complicated. It is complicated having a famous surname, especially if your parent is Marmite, as I say. You know, it's not like somebody that's completely universally adored. I would say, though, I had a really interesting childhood in which I was born with a silver networking spoon in my mouth. You know, lots and lots of connections and contacts and dinner parties and multitude of people, and I learned the soft skills that I wish every single child in every country could be graced with, which is the ability to just soak up what's around. So I had a very lucky childhood. I had an anxious childhood.
You use the word lucky rather than privileged, which I like.
I think, you know, my family comes from Middle Europe and Eastern Europe and the Holocaust, so I think they were lucky, and I'm lucky as a result of them being lucky. Look, privilege, I'm happy to debate it. I don't know. I'm middle class, but I hope that I'm not the kind of blind spot middle class that really doesn't recognise how lucky and or privileged they are.
So that environment then, a confident young girl? Did you have...
No, I wasn't. And I mean, you know, gosh, don't want to turn this into a therapist couch, Andy, but I don't know why, but I wasn't confident. I think probably, you know, I was the first generation of the generation that came out of the Europe because of the war.
Truly out of crisis.
Yeah. And I certainly think, as regards my mother, you know, my mum, her family in Vienna came out in 1936. They were an affluent family with servants, and, you know, my grandfather was a textile and a marble importer, and he had connections, and he heard that things were going to get tricky, and he used his connections to get the family out to Manchester in 1936. A lot of my other cousins, they left later. In fact, I reunited them all in Vienna last year, which was really
that must have
powerful.
been an astonishing...
It was really intense, and we all sat around a table and exchanged stories, some of which we didn't know, you know, about how on Kristallnacht in 1938, when anybody Jewish absolutely knew, you know, one of my cousins mothers came home from school because she'd been sent home and told, we can't teach you anymore, you're Jewish. And she came home and her brother had been beaten up. You know, really, really tough stuff. But my mother's family came out earlier. She was 4 and she was traumatised and she didn't speak for a year.
You've said that the family history left you sort of allergic to self-pity. And also, it seems, a real driving work ethic. Those two things connected, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, if you run your own business, as I have done and as I do, you've got to, you've got to be resilient, you've got to be tough, you've got to take the knocks, you've got to keep going, you've got to pick yourself up when things go wrong, and you have to work hard. You know, being self-employed, which is what owning your own business is, you know, there isn't really a safety net. But again, it comes back to risk. Some people are comfortable with risk and some aren't, and I realise I am. I don't quite know where that comes from, because actually, you know, my comfortable family background financially came from a tenured academic position. On the other hand, the family came from poverty. My father's father dropped dead on the doorstep, age 48, of a heart attack, looking for work.
Goodness.
So that drive probably percolated invisibly.
That came down for sure.
I think so.
You dropped out of university, right? That's a moment of risk. Certainly, one assumes a minor crisis as well. Do you recognise that as can you remember the feelings at the time? Did that feel that can't have been an easy conversation with your mum and dad? I
was a terrible dad academically, which is a bit weird, because actually I now realise it doesn't matter, that if you're curious and you self-learn, it sort of compensates for it. They were it was a crisis for them. I did very badly in my A-levels. I wanted to do English at Sussex University. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to read and literature. I didn't get the grades, and that there was a sense of crisis around that. I went to the Polytechnic of Central London, became the publications officer, got involved in student occupations, met the president of the Students' Union, who is now Reader, my husband. But it was a crisis for the family, because I just wanted to work.
Because you're publishing to start with.
Yes.
And then television not soon afterwards.
Yeah.
You were a researcher at Wogan, I think.
I was a researcher at Wogan. I mean, so I worked my way up. Because I came in as a secretary in a publishing house, as a self-taught typist, having watched my mum type. I self-taught myself to touch type. And in the old analogue days, I worked in a small medical publishers in Camden Town, having dropped out of Polytechnic. I was pretty much one of the first people in media to work without a degree. So I got a job in Thames Television, and was the first researcher they'd hired without a degree, and worked on a programme called Books by My Bedside. When there was a crisis, in fact, we did the last TV show with Salman Rushdie before the fatwa. And it went out as the programme was, you know.
So how was that? You're now finding yourself in some really interesting rooms.
Yeah, I found myself in some interesting
Was that
rooms.
the thing that ignite something? The kind of being around, when we now look what kind of came after. Was that a sort of moment at which you decided or could recognise, hang on, there's interesting stuff going on in the world. I can get a seat in the front row.
Yes, and I think, it's interesting, we're recording this as live, and I like live. That's sort of probably when I'm at my best. And working on television programmes, which is a lot faster than working in slow-mo publishing, was something that I enjoyed. And the strategy side, you know, how do we play this? How do we handle this? And you had great licence in those days. I was at the BBC. You only had to phone up and say I'm with the BBC, and you could sort of walk in any door.
So the picture we're getting here is of someone who's, how old are you at this stage?
I was early 20s.
Early 20s. It's, the picture being painted here is someone who is uber confident. But the truth is, I suspect,
yeah, weird. I wasn't.
A little bit more mixed. I would have thought there's two things going on here, right?
I think I've got a lot of front. I think anybody that knows me would say I've got a lot of front.
Yeah.
But of course, it's very common that the performers, the high performers, are the ones that, you know, have anxiety or imposter syndrome or whatever. And I think arguably it made me feel probably quite safe making other people look good. But no, I wasn't confident and I felt a bit of a failure. But I think that's healthy.
Were you concerned that the lack of qualifications was going to somehow catch up with you
Yeah.
at some point?
Yeah, I absolutely was. And to some degree, I think it's not unvalid in that I'm untrained, you know, and I do believe in training and teaching and learning. It's just that, interestingly, now we all have to constantly skill and learn. But there was a period of time where I was out of sync. You know, I went to a very famous school, the Camden School for Girls. Everybody was either the daughter of someone or they went to Oxbridge. And I was very, very unconfident in this school in the beginning. I mean, I didn't look the part. I didn't feel confident. I was bullied really badly at the beginning, horribly bullied. And never ever felt that I was, you know, in the right group or anything like that. And then I was told when it came to A-levels, after A-levels, you know, forget going to Oxford, you wouldn't get in. So yeah, that wasn't great.
I mean, even at that stage in your life, right, that's tough stuff to be dealing with. So there's something in you, isn't there, that is, and what do you attribute that to, I suppose, is the question. Do you, and where are you on kind of, you know, nature nurture on that stuff?
Well, I think as a lesson it is important to keep pushing on, but it's important to also come to terms with what it is you're feeling. So I think if I could have those years again, I would be a little bit kinder to myself and I would be a bit more sympathetic, which is, oh, you're having a hard time, you don't feel like you fit in, you know, never mind. You're doing the best you can, whereas I was quite sort of punitive on myself.
But is it not that though that caused you to keep pushing on and pushing through? This is the difficulty with this stuff, isn't it?
I think I pushed on because I've got a natural enthusiasm and curiosity and a drive, and I think I probably got that from two sources. One is my dad, which is my dad was endlessly curious about the world, and I think that was a fantastic gift to be given. And I saw him eat up ideas and life, and I wanted that. And the second is there was a woman in my family called Gretel Lentz, who I even look a bit like, who was my grandmother's niece. My grandmother was the youngest of a number of sisters, and Gretel's mum, Susie, died in the Holocaust. She was one of the ones that didn't get out in time, and Gretel did, with her brother Hans, if you can believe it, Hansel and Gretel. And she was just an extraordinary woman. She had a business called Lindsay Design. Her business partner was shot dead in the 60s in Soho. You couldn't make it up.
Oh, goodness.
And when I was very young and very unconfident, she pointed a bony finger at me and she said, "I put my money on you." And I've never forgotten it. And I held on to that little thought. Because actually, my mum didn't really have confidence in me. That was the problem, I think. You know, my mum, who had problems of her own, bless her, she thought I was going to be like her, which was the girl who's never allowed to shine.
Yeah.
And so I think it probably narked her that I behaved like the girl that did want to shine. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
In that unconscious thing that happens between parents. So it was very nice to have a role model who just said, no, you are, you know, you can do it.
So often you hear that people who are seemingly kind of defied or punched through, that it comes down to a conversation like that.
Oh, definitely.
It comes down to someone saying, "Nah, you'll be all right."
Oh, definitely. And you've got to have people around you who see you or see something in you. Yeah. And if you don't, I definitely think you're in trouble.
Let's shoot forward a bit. Let's go to the 90s. You became a fundraising consultant for the Labour Party. But as we've already touched on, the truth is you are not sort of rabidly tribal at all. But it obviously felt like the right team to back at the time. I mean, you were raising money for John Smith, I think I'm right in saying.
I actually did the fundraiser with John Smith the night before he died, and we're doing this podcast, you know, around the time of the 30th anniversary of his death, which I remember vividly. I mean, I thought I was tribal at that time, Andy. You can imagine, I grew up in my background.
Of course,
my Euro-communist father backed the Labour Party. Neil Kinnock and all that crew, you know, was very pro. You know, my father was a big figure in those days in the Labour Party. And I was the Labour Party's first high-value donor fundraiser. And I loved it. Peter Mandelson spotted very early on that I was a liability. He never trusted me because he could tell that I wasn't overly committed to the kind of
Right.
It was very
You'd
interesting.
failed some test or other that he set
I failed a
you.
Peter Mandelson test.
Yeah.
And I'm rather proud of that, really.
Yes.
But I thought that I was tribal, and I think I was the right person in the right time because I've got this sort of slightly entrepreneurial risk tendency. I did these high value donor dinners which were rather unpopular with the left at the time.
Yeah.
You know, I remember Newsnight and Jeremy Paxman you know, doing a programme about how can the Labour Party be doing £500 plate pay by plate dinners.
When do you start, do you think, at what age did you start to understand that what was going on in those rooms was really about influence and power?
Oh, well, I think I understood that, funnily enough, earlier. When I was at Virago Press, I was Maya Angelou's book publicist, which was the big privilege of my life. And there was a wonderful coterie of Maya Angelou and Jon Snow and Jessica Mitford and Neil Kinnock and the Tambos and the anti-apartheid movement people. And I remember realising, you know, I was very, very young and I used to be in these sort of social settings. It's when you're in a social setting with people with influence that you really begin to feel it, because people are off guard and
You can be excited and you can be interested. That doesn't necessarily give you the understanding of what's really going on in those rooms. You seem to have worked that out pretty early.
I think I probably am a strategist. I think I can notice power, but also I'm not really very turned on by it. That might be why I understand it.
Yes.
You know, I think it's crucial if you work with people who are powerful that they don't feel you're fazed by them, and they only feel you're not fazed by them if you're not.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not fazed by them, and maybe that did come from my background. You know, if people know that you are on the level, you know, I mean, I've only broken someone's trust once, and it was awful. And I did it kind of under pressure, in that it was a very, very close friend whose husband was playing away from home, and it was kind of obvious. No one talked about it. And a mutual friend who was tricky, who had her own issues, sort of went, oh, go on, tell me what you know, tell me what you know. And in a moment of weakness, I basically confirmed what I knew.
Right.
And this other friend beetled off to my real friend and told her that I knew and that I told her.
And did that break apart your friendship?
Well, it actually didn't. It was calamitous. That was a crisis. That was a real crisis of friendship, because I loved this woman. And she phoned up and she went, what the hell have you done? And I thought, well, I literally went into crisis management mode, actually, Andy. I thought, well, what have I got? Be truthful, be transparent. And I said, you're completely right. I did confirm it, and I absolutely shouldn't have done. But I'm going to tell you the context. And the context is, A, it was true, and you're upset about the fact that it's true, not about, you know, really that's the crisis for you. And B, can we talk about what was motivating our mutual friend? And then I said, but you've now got a choice, which is you are completely within your rights to not want to be friends with me anymore. And I would accept that. I'd feel devastated, but I have broken your trust. And she was completely fantastic. She went, I'd like to think about it. And I said, okay. And for about 4 days, I thought, that's it. And then she rang up and she said, I'm livid, but you're right. you were coerced by somebody who was, am I allowed to say shit stirring? Who was shit stirring? And we are going to resume our friendship. And it became, and still is, one of the most valuable friendships of my life.
Oh,
because in a funny way, in friendship, you're not allowed to have crisis. And I think you should more.
Yeah, how interesting that the principles of that anecdote hold
They
in
do,
so
don't they?
many different other contexts.
Yes, they do. I learned a really important lesson then.
Yeah.
I think crisis is in three forms. One is personal, one is professional / political, and the other in a way is cultural or existential, right? It's sort of out there and it kind of infects everything. But a personal crisis or even a professional crisis can be like that, out of nowhere, quick. Whereas some of the other forms of crisis can, be elongated. Do you know what I mean?
I do. Let's go to the business that you built. You set up a very successful PR firm with Sarah McCauley, as she was then. You introduced Sarah, I think, to her husband, Gordon Brown.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Superb piece of matchmaking.
Yes.
You have a very successful business, but it goes horribly wrong because of a debt, I think, that was rather unfairly lumbered on you, or lumbered on the business, and a bankruptcy followed. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, it's slightly complicated. Don't want to go into crisis management mode, but there's a big NDA that covers the end of the business relationship with Sarah Brown as was.
Sure.
It was a bad debt, and yeah, that was difficult because reputationally, especially in Britain, failure is not an option. And luckily I've been going to America loads.
Right.
And so I'm really not frightened of failure. It's a bit icky sometimes. And there was certainly a moment in the middle of this bad debt crisis when it was late at night and I emailed myself, I thought, the kind of direness of the financials. And I remember driving back through Hampstead at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. Those were the days of the desktops when you had to do whatever your business was in the office. And my cousin...
Glorious days, as we now look back on them.
Well, discuss. And my cousin, Zach, who's a brilliant comms guy, he phoned and he went, "Hi, Jules, just got your email." And I went, "Email? What email?" He went, "Did you..." Well, I said, "That's why I'm phoning. Did you mean to send me that email?" And literally, of course, cold sweat.
You had sent the most sort of damaging...
Oversharing email
to
completely
about
everybody.
your finances to everybody in your contact.
Yeah. And then the Evening Standard promptly ran... an article, or maybe that was even later. There's so many crises, Andy, I can't keep up with them. But at a certain point, Evening Standard ran a piece with the memorable headline, "Sunsets on Queen of Spin." And I thought, well, there's only one way to contain this crisis, which is to sort of own it. And I wrote to the then editor, Veronica Wadley, and I said, look, all is fair in love, war and journalism, right? Do what you got to do, but I've one absolute request. You can be wrong, some of what you wrote was wrong, but please, can you not use that ugly photo, and can I get a nice photo to use if you're going to be mean in the future? She was very gracious and she said yes.
You've had your fair share of criticism over the years as well. I mean, one of the most unpleasant things that's been written about you is, great dad, shame about the lightweight daughter.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
unpleasant stuff.
Yes.
How do you handle criticism? Do you let it in for a bit, get the context wrapped around it, and then move on, or do these things stay with you?
I'm terribly, terribly thin-skinned. My husband is brilliant at sort of saying, "Get over it and don't worry about it," and So it's sort of odd in a sense because, when it's like the really big stuff, I can be strategic. But equally, if I'm misunderstood, it upsets me. And I think I think lots of people feel that. I think it causes a personal crisis to feel misunderstood or to be willfully distorted.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's not a good feeling.
Yeah.
Especially when it's motivated.
Yeah. Well, that's where anxiety really lives, isn't it? The gap between
Yeah.
the truth and
Yeah.
what, in those sort of reputational circumstances,
Yeah.
how you're being characterised. Does it manifest into anxiety for you? Those, when those moments have come.
Yes, I mean, I do suffer from anxiety and confidence. I don't suffer from depression, but I do get in a state quite often, and I have to learn how to overcome that. I get cross and angry and start babbling to anyone who'll listen, like, this happened, and then I've learned to recognise, oh, wait a minute, you're in a bit of a state, calm down. I mean, look, I'm older now and a bit wiser, but the point I'm making is, yes, I do sometimes take criticism personally, but on the other hand, if you don't, then you're not connected with what you're doing, so you have to be criticised sometimes.
Let's talk about 2007. You're on holiday with your family. You realise that your health was in decline. Actually, in a pretty dramatic way, you go out for a run and collapse, I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah, so I was running editorial intelligence. My third baby was 1.5. I'd just moved us from home, where I thought I was going to be a schoolgate mum running the business from home, into an office, because the baby once nibbled the corners off all the envelopes in my mailing when I was at home, and that was a bit of a crisis. So I thought I'd better get an office. So I got an office, worked all hours, had a cold for 6 months, didn't really pay attention to it, and then went on holiday. And I went for a run, which was a bad idea because I wasn't a runner. I was quite overweight, and collapsed, and had pneumonia and sepsis, and I was really lucky because I really did nearly die.
So taken from there to a local hospital.
Well, it was a bit of a weird story. We had all 5 kids. I've got 2 stepchildren and 3 kids, and everybody was 11 or under, I think. So it was like heavy, and it was very hot, and I stuck it out for a few days. My husband just thought I had flu upstairs, and then I called my cousin, who's a brilliant doctor, and he screamed down the phone at me, get in the car now, go to hospital. And I thought, I'm going to wait till the evening when the baby's in bed, otherwise it's going to be chaos. And I sort of thought, I know I'm really ill, but I know that I'll be alive if I could just get it through to the evening. And then it was a bit blue light. We went to the local hospital, and they told my husband to drive very fast to Ipswich Hospital. And then that was the beginning of what now turns out to be quite a horrible autoimmune thing.
Yes, that's manifested itself in other ways,
yeah,
particularly with your eye.
And then I had, so I sort of got over that, got well. Then I got all sorts of sort of colitis-related problems, which are all inflammatory. And they're also, everything's a bit anxiety related, stress, good stress, bad stress. It's all a bit of a murky area. But the real kind of and present problem started just after the pandemic. And one of my eyes just felt wobbly, and the vision was wobbly, and I thought, I didn't know what it was. I went and got tested, and they were kind of like, get to the hospital sort of thing. And I've got a really complicated eye condition. I'm at Moorfields all the time. I have to have horrid injections once a month. I'm on lots of medication. And it's part of a systemic thing. Basically, any soft tissue in my body appears to go into meltdown, given half a chance.
So we talked about how you've been handling the business pressures and the sort of professional stress.
Yeah.
I mean, can I ask, how are you, a similar approach are you taking? In terms of your health, obviously the process itself is completely different, but I mean, in terms of your mindset, how are you handling that?
Well, you have to, if you get quite ill, chronically ill, say, you have to lean into it and take it seriously and absorb it and there, I said that interesting word, assimilate. I definitely don't feel self-pity. I feel enormously lucky, partly because I'm a bit of an operator, so I know how to operate the system, say, of the NHS, which is hard to operate. You have to be assertive. You have to know when to say, hang on a minute, I need to be seen, or whatever. So I feel lucky that I have those skills. I feel lucky that I live near Moorfield. Goodness me, there are some people, they come in from miles away, Andy, and they've got much worse problems than me. We have a mutual friend, Jessica Morris, who I knew all my career. Absolutely dazzling woman.
Another mentor?
Definitely a mentor. But a kind of unconscious mentor, in that we just riffed off each other, and I watched what she did, and, you know, I watched the way she'd have a baby on one hip and she'd be stirring a cool looking risotto in her wonderful kitchen and juggling a tremendously demanding job as head of campaigns and communications at Shelter, the housing homeless charity. And I thought, wow, you know, role models as sort of separate to mentors, I think.
Yes.
And she was definitely a role model to me. And she got very sick. She had a glioblastoma, which, as you know very well, all about. And then she set up her charity, Our Brain Bank, and I got involved in that. But it was 5 years of crisis. And it's possible that my health problems were triggered by the combination of coping with the stress and anxiety and pain and wretchedness of the pandemic and her final years, and these nightmarish book deadlines I was on.
Yes.
Yes. It's unquantifiably upsetting when somebody you love deeply is so ill. Yeah. You don't need me to tell you that.
Yeah. Well, let's explain that you very kindly introduced me to Jessica after my sister was unfortunately received the same diagnosis, and thanks to that connection, I was then lucky enough to get involved with Our Brain Bank as well, and to meet Jessica and the Our Brain Bank team, who do fantastic work.
But I think that was,
for people with that diagnosis and their families.
I think that's what made us very connected, is that we've got a shared history. We've come across each other in a previous life professionally, and I saw you not long after you re-emerged into kind of the life you're living now. And almost the first thing you told me about, I said, come and have a cup of coffee, didn't I? And the first thing you told me about was your sister, and it was so obvious that that was top of your mind, that nothing else mattered as much to you. And I was very moved by that. And then I told you about Jessica. And that, you know, it comes back to that trust thing. If you can find a point of connection with somebody, and sometimes it can be a really positive, wonderful thing, but quite often it's a really negative thing.
Yes. You're embarking on a mission to complete 60 soul cycle sessions before your birthday in August, Julia.
Yes, I am.
To raise funds for Our Brain Bank.
Yeah.
You started in March, I think.
How am I doing?
How's it going?
Yeah, it's fine. I did one yesterday. What it is that I go to New York a lot for work. Jessica lived in New York. And I used to go more frequently because at the time I was on the board of Our Brain Bank, and she got really quite dangerously ill several times, and I'd nip over. And I used to go and do these soul cycles, which, for anybody who doesn't know what they are, it's basically the Peloton stationary bike, but in a fitness class, like kind of aerobics. And I used to think about her and will her on in those moments. And then the pandemic happened. Nobody did soul cycle anymore. Then I got all my health problems and I couldn't do it. And then a few months ago I thought, I really miss that adrenaline and that buzz. I wonder whether I can do it. And then I sort of had a bit of a light bulb moment. I thought, this is how I can contribute to the charity, is to fundraise. I've got to say, I'm having a wonderful time doing it.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to put the link in the information alongside this podcast. So, you know, anyone listening to this, watching this, please support Julia. The cause, I can tell you, cannot be more important. Let's talk about Israel and Gaza, which is obviously front of mind now. You are a proud Jewish woman. How have those events impacted you, given that history that you've explained, given your family's history? How has it impacted you?
Well, it's impacted me severely, like everybody, Jewish, but not necessarily in the way you might expect. First of all, I think back to the point that I made about there being three kinds of crisis: personal, professional, and existential or cultural. I think that Israel-Gaza is a massive existential crisis for Jews, because it conflates being Jewish with being Israeli or pro-Israeli. And all my life I have known that I am Jewish, but not part of the Jewish community that unthinkingly, unquestioningly, mangling, supports Israel. Now, I can't tell you why that is, Andy. I do have relatives in Israel. I do absolutely appreciate and understand the origins of the state of Israel, but I've never quite bought it as a reason to do what I think has been done for many, many years, which is the suppression of the Palestinian people. And I've always been slightly shunned in Jewish community quarters here.
You felt that pretty clearly?
Yeah. And I tried really, really hard to be a good British Jew, Andy. I'd haul my husband off to synagogues and we'd do Friday night dinners and everything. I just found it really, really alienating. Whereas, if I died tomorrow, one of the first things people would say about me, other than probably being my father's daughter, is that I'm Jewish. I mean, look at me. I'm doing the hand thing. I look Jewish, ethnically Jewish. I'm culturally Jewish. And yet, but I'm not in the mainstream, or what was the mainstream until October the 7th. And I think it caused a personal crisis, but also a personal epiphany for me, which is I realised I'm actually not alone. There's a lot of Jews who feel like me, absolutely 100% Jewish, rooted, connected to the history of the Holocaust. I struggle to see anything about the Holocaust because I find it too painful, because it's too raw, because some of my family perished in the camps, right? I literally can't see certain things without I become ill, actually, if I watch certain programmes. But I don't feel an affinity to Israel. I feel my Jewishness is not to do with Israel, and that is a crisis.
Do you feel like you're in crisis now?
No, now I feel liberated from it. It was a crisis in the month between the 7th of October and about the middle of November. And interestingly, I went to New York, and the depth of the crisis was laid bare to me when I had a conversation with a very, very dear friend of mine. In fact, he's passionately pro-Israeli Jewish, and we had a huge row. And I said, listen, this is a crisis. This is real. We have a decision to make. I do not think the same as you, and you do not think the same as me. I said, but I love you, and I respect where you're coming from, and I hope that you respect where I'm coming from, but if you don't, you don't. And to his great, great credit, he struggled with it, but no, we're still friends. But we don't talk about it.
Well, it doesn't. Therein lies perhaps a piece of advice that could go an awful lot wider.
Yes.
If we put it that way.
Yes.
The ability to disagree agreeably, to use that horrible
phrase.
Yeah,
it's so painful for everybody.
Yeah.
I hate the vulgarity of some of the language that's used. I hate the sarcasm and the brutality and the simplification of a situation that's really complicated. But on the other hand, I am pretty uncompromising. I am not a Jew who stands with Israel in this war. And I can't make myself that kind of Jew. And it makes me unpopular with quite a lot in my own community. And that's the way it is. But it doesn't mean I don't feel sympathy or respect for their position. And I'd hope they feel the same for mine.
Julia, let's talk about the book, Working Assumptions. What we thought about what we knew about work before COVID and AI, and what we know now. In short, is the workplace in crisis?
Yes, absolutely. In short, the workplace is in crisis, and it's in crisis because it was in crisis before the pandemic, but sometimes it takes a different crisis to uncover the underlying crisis.
As you know, I like the word crisis. I use it as often as I possibly can. The title of this podcast is a bit of a clue. But I do also think that the word crisis is overused. Workplace has always been in a form of crisis because it comes with change, right?
Well,
because our work is at the centre of change, whether it's technological, whether it's societal, whether it's, what kind of state was the workplace in, post-war?
I think you're completely right. In fact, I write about the past, present and future of work. And in fact, in my last book, The Nowhere Office, I dated the changes to the Second World War, and I said that the Normandy landings was a good example of the first pop-up office, Andy, where we think about the troops and we think about the boats, but we don't think about the holorith machines and the typewriters and
Indeed.
All the back end that was also on the beaches.
Yeah.
You're completely right. Flux and stasis are in competition with each other, and the workplace is always in flux. But I think work and working life has been in crisis for a very long time, and it's always been covered over. I mean, just to give you an example, the American economy is $300 billion a year caused by stress. A lot of stress is caused by workplace problems. So my argument is that work could work so much better. Actually, I'm an evangelist for work.
Yes.
And really what I'm trying to do is tell the story of work. But I will just say, I think there is a particular crisis of work at the moment caused by three things. One is the pandemic. We're not over it. 3 million people died. Huge numbers of people have got long COVID. That's the first thing. And that created all the upset around hybrid working and the end of certain office spaces being viable and all the disruption. The second is AI. AI is going to change jobs, cut jobs, cause stress in the workplace. That's not exactly a crisis, but it's a challenge.
Challenge, for sure.
And then the third thing is that we are at an incredibly important, pivotal generational shift where, dare I say, our generations and a little bit older, we are phasing out of the workplace. Not right this second, but soon enough. And a new, what I call amazing age is emerging of millennials, alphas, and even the baby Zs. Sorry, the Zs, millennials and baby alphas that are coming into the workplace. And that is a crisis for the workplace, because I can tell you through the consulting that I do, millennial managers haven't the foggiest how to deal with their Zs. The boomers don't know how to talk to the millennials. There is a crisis of communication. Now, it doesn't mean that each individual workplace can't have happy stories and, then we're talking about leadership. But do I think the workplace and work has been in crisis and is in crisis? Yes, I do.
Julia, we've covered a lot of ground, I think.
You've been stabbing your iPad rather purposefully.
I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and I've really, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I said at the beginning that I think there's a lot to learn from you, and I don't think I was wrong about that. I really appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure.
And being so, you are just, a force of nature.
If you've enjoyed this conversation with Julia, then please do leave us a review. And if you found it helpful or inspiring even, we would be delighted if you recommended us to your friends. You can watch the full episodes on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and if you hit subscribe, you'll find loads more crisis conversations. As always, full transcripts are available on our website, along with links. Just head to crisiswhatcrisis.com. And thank you so much for listening.